A trembling finger curled tighter around the trigger. The officer's eyes darted, flickering between the man's still face and the badge clipped to his belt. Rain spat against the sidewalk, cold and insistent, as if the sky itself rejected what was happening. The lawyer didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply stood, eyes calm, hands visible, breath even, as though the gun pointed at his chest were no more dangerous than a gust of wind. Pedestrians stopped. No one intervened. Eyes watched from under umbrellas, from coffee shop windows, from the safety of parked cars. Phones were out, but silence ruled. That same cowardly silence that always crept in just before injustice made itself at home. His suit was tailored, his briefcase expensive, his skin dark. A moment passed, then another. Still, he didn't kneel. His name was Elijah Bennett, 38, a former public defender. Now a civil rights attorney with a reputation that whispered through courtrooms and roared through communities. Elijah had walked into courtrooms with steel in his spine and mercy in his voice, but none of that mattered now. Not to the officer whose knuckles whitened around a service pistol, not to the dispatcher stalling for backup, and not to the two bystanders who whispered, "Why doesn't he just obey?" Elijah knew this script. He had written essays about it, spoken on it, defended clients swallowed by it, but living it, staring down a weapon on a city sidewalk for walking too close to his own car, that was different. The officer's voice cracked. "I said get on your knees." But Elijah only stared, breath steady. There was no rage in his eyes, only memory. Memory of every name that came before his, of George, of Brianna, of Tamia, and memory, too, of promises. Promises to speak when others couldn't. Promises not to kneel. He wouldn't break that promise. Okay, wouldn't break that promise. Just then, tires screeched nearby. Doors slammed. The murmurs intensified. And a single voice, older, deeper, slow with rage, cut through the static in the air. "Oh, what are you doing?" All at once, the officer's hand dropped. His gun clattered to the sidewalk like it had burned him. Across the crowd, a tall man in dress blues approached. Grey at his temples, rage barely contained in his eyes. Chief of Police Harold Grant, but no one dared speak yet, because no one, not even Elijah, knew just how much was about to change. Elijah hadn't always worn suits and spoke like thunder rolling over marble. Once, he wore baggy hoodies and stammered through his first mock trial at Lincoln High. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the hospital and still managed to show up to his every debate meet, Elijah had learned early that survival was not silence. It was eloquence. It was eloquence. It was standing tall with trembling legs. It was refusing to disappear. He'd graduated top of his class, joined the military straight out of high school, not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to earn his mother something this world rarely offered black women, peace of mind. After serving in military intelligence for 6 years, Elijah came home. He had stories, some dark, some stained with dust and blood, but he rarely told them. What he spoke about instead were laws, systems, justice. He entered law school at 26, slept in his car the first semester. Ate ramen and borrowed books and took notes with hands that still trembled when he heard fireworks. But he made it. Every client he defended knew he'd been forged in fire long before he walked into any courtroom. But this morning, as he left the courthouse after winning yet another wrongful arrest case, he had no idea that fate had one more story to write. Not in filings or verdicts, but on the wet sidewalk of a city too used to forgetting its own shame. The confrontation began when Officer Brady, 3 years on the force, already facing 2 internal complaints, spotted Elijah unlocking the door of a sleek black BMW outside the courthouse. A car too nice, he'd later claim. The man too calm. Brady's mind didn't reach for logic. It reached for assumption, then suspicion, then escalation. "Hey, step away from the vehicle." Elijah looked over, puzzled. "It's mine," he said softly, showing the keys, his ID. But Brady wasn't listening. He saw posture he mistook for defiance, hands he thought might move too fast, eyes that didn't drop in submission, so he reached for the only language power knows when it feels threatened. Steel, orders, threats. And now a crowd had gathered. It wasn't the crowd that unnerved Elijah. It was the silence. People had phones, but not voices. He had stood up for so many. But who would stand for him? His heart pounded, but his stance didn't change. He wouldn't kneel. Chief Grant had been in a nearby meeting with city officials when the emergency call came through. Civilian non-compliance, possible vehicle theft, suspicious individual. But the bodycam image on the dispatcher's screen stopped him cold. He knew that face. He'd seen it in press conferences, shaking hands with senators, comforting grieving mothers after officer-involved shootings. He'd also seen it over coffee in long, bitter conversations about how much had to change. Elijah Bennett, the man who should never be in cuffs, the man who had once saved Grant's own niece from a bogus conviction. Without another word, Grant left the meeting. 10 minutes later, he was standing between his officer and a man who should have never had a weapon pointed at him. The officer stammered, Sir, he wasn't complying. I thought Grant's voice was ice. You thought a black man in a suit walking to his own car was a threat? No answer. Grant's voice dropped lower, trembling not with uncertainty but fury. How that man has defended more people in this city than you've probably stopped for a taillight. You aimed your weapon at a lawyer, a veteran, a man whose shoes you're not qualified to polish. The sidewalk fell even quieter, even quieter. Elijah said nothing. He didn't smirk, didn't nod. He just picked up his briefcase. Grant turned to him. Mr. Bennett, I am so sorry. Elijah's eyes finally showed something. Not victory, exhaustion. Not the kind sleep fixes, the kind history hands down through generations. He nodded once. I know. I know. Grant swallowed hard. Then he did something no one expected. He turned back to the officer, took the man's badge and said, with finality, You're done. No yelling, no theatrics. Just silence. The kind that comes when justice finally shows up wearing its own uniform. The air was still heavy, not just with rain, but with something older, the weight of 100 years of silence breaking, one quiet act at a time. Chief Grant held the badge like it was a shard of glass. His face was unreadable, but his hands trembled slightly, as if this wasn't just about Elijah, or this officer, or even this city. Elijah didn't move right away. He looked at the crowd instead. Eyes still wide, phone still up, but none of them had stepped forward. Not one voice had spoken up. He didn't hate them for it. He understood. Fear had a way of coiling itself around people's throats, especially when justice came in uniforms and guns and paperwork that never made it to court. People had seen too much, said too little. They weren't villains. How? Just exhausted by a system that punished noise and rewarded silence. The officer was still trying to speak. I didn't mean, it wasn't about race. I thought but Elijah had already turned away. There were no words that could undo the weight of a barrel pointed at his heart. Chief Grant, to his credit, didn't try to follow him immediately. He knew Elijah, knew the man needed air more than apologies, knew his silence was not surrender, but grief in motion. As Elijah stepped around the corner, his shoes clicking against wet pavement, he passed a little boy holding his mother's hand. The boy looked up, eyes wide, and whispered, Is he in trouble? His mother shook her head slowly. No, baby, he's a good man. Elijah didn't look back, but he heard it. And he carried those words like armor. 2 hours later, the city was talking. The footage was already everywhere. The confrontation, the badge being taken, the silence of the lawyer who never lifted his voice. Some were angry, defending the officer, claiming misunderstanding, questioning why Elijah didn't just comply. But most were quiet, thoughtful, ashamed, because the man in the video wasn't yelling, wasn't fighting. He was simply standing, and still a weapon was drawn. Somehow, that hurt more. Inside the station, Chief Grant stared at a blank monitor. He hadn't spoken to the press, not yet. He wasn't ready for cameras, not this time. He thought of his father, a cop before him, who had grown up in a world where badges were shields for only some, and batons were often used for reminders, not protection. And he thought of Elijah, that day in court 3 years ago, defending a teenager the system had already decided was guilty. He'd watched the young lawyer tear apart a prosecution with calm brilliance, never raising his voice, never playing to the jury. Just facts, just dignity. Now that same man had been made to feel small on a street he paid taxes to walk on. Grant clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let it go. Pooh. Elijah sat on the worn leather couch in his office, the one no client ever saw, tucked behind the bookshelves and case files. His tie was gone. His dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His phone buzzed every few seconds. Media, friends, colleagues. He didn't respond to any of them. Across the room, an old photo sat framed on his desk, his mother in scrubs, smiling after a 16-hour shift. Beside her, a younger Elijah in military uniform. That smile, the quiet kind with no celebration, always stayed with him. That was the smile he'd worn when he passed the bar, when he won his first case, when he bought this office. And now that smile felt far away. He didn't feel angry, he felt tired, because the badge had been taken, yes, and maybe that officer would be held accountable. But it wasn't about one man. It was about every time he walked into a store and was watched, every time a cab didn't stop, every time a white client looked at him and blinked when he said, "I'm your attorney." That weight didn't vanish with a single act of justice. But still, something was different this time. The next morning, Elijah arrived early at the courthouse for a hearing. He didn't expect anything to be different. He didn't want applause or handshakes. He just wanted to work. But as he entered the lobby, something stopped him. A quiet line of people. Well, they weren't holding signs, they weren't chanting. They were just standing, silent, still. 20 or 30 of them. Court clerks, former clients, other attorneys, even a janitor he'd once helped keep from eviction, all standing, heads bowed slightly. One by one, as he walked past, they placed a hand over their heart. He tried to keep walking, but his steps slowed, his breath caught. At the end of the line stood Chief Grant. No cameras, no reporters, just him, and in his hand, a folder. "Internal review is complete," he said quietly. "Brady's dismissed, and we're implementing mandatory bias training." Real training, not the checkerbox kind. Elijah said nothing, until he did. "You know this doesn't end with him, right?" "I know, and it doesn't end with me." Grant nodded. But it starts somewhere." Elijah took the folder, not because he needed it, but because he knew the gesture mattered. The crowd remained silent, not out of fear this time, but reverence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't viral, it wasn't a revolution, but it was respect, and for Elijah, that was enough, for now. The courtroom was humming quietly when Elijah entered, not with noise, but with a certain undercurrent, like people had read the headlines, seen the footage, and were waiting to see how a man who had been humiliated in public would carry himself now. He didn't wear vengeance on his shoulders. No defiance in his step, just the same steady walk, the same charcoal grey suit, the same quiet focus that had always made him different. Today, he was defending a 16-year-old boy named Marcus, charged with resisting arrest and property damage. Elijah knew the case was deeper than it looked. He'd seen the body cam, he'd seen the bruises, and he'd seen something else. The way Marcus wouldn't look anyone in the eye, like the system had already convinced him he didn't matter. But Elijah didn't carry rage into that courtroom. He carried presence, and that presence shifted things. Oh, yeah. Even the prosecutor, a hardened man known for harsh sentencing recommendations, kept glancing over at Elijah as if unsure whether to lean into aggression or caution. When the judge entered and the gavel hit wood, the room hushed. Testimonies came and went. Officers claimed Marcus had lunged. Elijah didn't flinch. He waited. Then, when it was his turn, he stood and slowly walked to the center of the room. "I have only one question," he said. "How do we judge a child by the way he's been treated? Or by the way he's been treated? Or by the way he still believes someone might see him?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He just let the silence settle after his words, like dust floating through late morning light. The jury leaned forward. The judge narrowed her eyes thoughtfully, and Marcus, for the first time since his arrest, looked up. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He'd felt it shift. The hearing ended. Deliberations took time, but not long. Marcus was released into his mother's custody with community service. The judge, a woman known for her strictness, added one final comment. "Mr. Brooks, I trust we'll be seeing more of your work in this courtroom." Elijah nodded once. He didn't smile. Not yet. Because one boy walking free didn't fix what had happened in that street. But it mattered. And in that moment it was enough. Outside, the courthouse steps were busier than usual. A few journalists lingered. Some community members. A small group of students from the local university who'd followed Elijah's story. "Imi-san," she said, voice trembling. "He's been in trouble. Not bad trouble, but he needs someone who sees him the way you see that boy. Elijah looked at her, and not with pity, not with detachment, with understanding. Tell him to come by, he said. We'll talk. He'll talk. She looked like she might cry, but instead she whispered, "A thank you," and stepped back into the crowd. That was how it began. One conversation, one story, one moment of dignity offered when the world had tried to take it away. Days passed, then weeks. Days passed, then the officer who had drawn his weapon on Elijah remained under investigation, but was no longer in uniform. Internal affairs worked slowly, but the political pressure had begun to mount, not because Elijah had demanded it, but because the city had. Clergy members spoke. Veterans wrote open letters. Even a retired federal judge issued a statement. When a man like Elijah Brooks can be seen as a threat, we must ask, not what he did wrong, but what we've allowed to become normal. It was spreading, quietly, powerfully, a reckoning not of rage, but of resolve, and Elijah kept showing up, not as a symbol, not as a victim, just as a man doing his job, defending the forgotten, listening when others shouted, standing when others knelt to expediency, and in that silence something sacred grew. Then one morning something happened Elijah hadn't expected. He was walking into his office when he found a small envelope taped to the door. No name, no postage, just one word written on the front in block letters. Respect. He opened it. Inside, a folded sheet of lined paper, handwritten. "I'm sorry. I was the officer. I drew my weapon because I was afraid. But I realize now I was afraid of the wrong thing. You didn't move, didn't shout, didn't threaten, and I still pointed a gun at you. I was trained to see danger, but no one ever taught me to see dignity. That's on me. I've left the force, but I haven't left the work. I'm starting over. You showed me what real strength looks like. I hope one day I can be even half as brave as you were in that moment." There was no signature. Elijah stood for a long time, the letter open in his hand. Then he folded it once more and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. He didn't speak of it to anyone. Some truths were too heavy for press releases, some forgiveness too sacred for cameras. Months later, Chief Grant visited him again, not at the courthouse, not in uniform, at a neighborhood fundraiser for after-school programs. He found Elijah near a table of donated books. "We're becoming the face of something bigger than law," Grant said quietly. Elijah didn't look up from the book in his hand. "I don't care about being a face. I know. That's why people listen." He paused. "You ever think about running for something? Wing? Office, maybe?" Elijah closed the book gently. "I'm already where I'm needed." He smiled, soft, steady, that same smile from the photo with his mother. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had just waited. And so he kept walking, into courthouses, into classrooms, into lives frayed by fear and stitched back together with hope. He didn't wear a cape, didn't carry a weapon, just showed up every day, like quiet was his shield and justice his compass. And in a city that had once doubted his right to stand still without being feared, Elijah Brooks became the reminder they didn't know they needed. That sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who refuses to shout. That dignity doesn't need to raise its voice, and that true power stands still.